Hello, and welcome to the new lecture of the module Decision Making for Autonomous Robots. My name is Marija, and in this lecture we cover sampling-based techniques for robot motion planning. The basic idea behind these approaches is to sample the configuration space of the robot in an environment in order to find a roadmap capturing the connectivity of the free space. We can then follow the edges of this roadmap in order to find a safe and collision-free path so that the robot can move between points and perform useful tasks. As we will see, these approaches are very commonly used in highly dimensional problem spaces and also in very complex environments due to their efficiency. In this lecture, we cover different sampling-based methods and discuss their properties. To start, let's revisit the already very familiar robot path planning problem, which is what we're trying to solve with these methods. As we said in previous lectures, the goal of path planning is to find a safe collision-free path to move a robot from a start configuration in its environment to a goal configuration. And that implies without running into any obstacles or self-collisions. In this lecture, as in the previous ones, we focus on what's called the classical path planning problem, which seeks to find the shortest geometric path connecting these two configurations. And so the closer a path is to the shortest possible one, the better or the more optimal it is. And this is what we'll consider as our measure of path optimality. To recap again, here are some of the planning methods that we encountered in previous lectures. A previous lecture especially focused on search-based techniques, which operate on discrete graph-like representations of the environment. And with these methods, we used a search-based algorithm in order to find feasible paths. In this lecture, we focused on sampling-based methods, which operate on a very different paradigm. So rather than using an explicit representation of the environment, sampling-based methods incrementally probe the configuration space in order to find feasible paths that are later connected. And we'll look at this in the next slides, exactly how it is done. So with this, we can now define more concretely a sampling-based approach. So what a sampling-based method needs is a known environment. So we assume we know the geometry and the locations of all the obstacles, as well as the extent of the robot coordinates of its configurations. We also assume that we have a robot model as well, including its geometry and its kinodynamic constraints that we might incorporate into our planning strategy. And of course, we have the start and goal configurations that define our path planning problem. And in the same way as when we looked at search-based methods, we assume no sources of motion uncertainty or sensing uncertainty. So we assume that the robot can perfectly follow the paths that we plan for it. So sampling-based methods effectively apply a sampling strategy in order to capture the connectivity of the free space. So why would we want to sample? What would be the benefit? So here we have a grid, a uniform grid with square cells that we use when we want to plan with a search-based strategy. So for example, if we applied A star, even with a perfect heuristic on the simple environment with one obstacle, we would get such a path connecting the start to the goal, where the red are basically the explored cells if we were using a perfect heuristic, which remember gives us the ideal cost from a particular node to the goal and direct the search in a very focused way. That's all well and good for this simple environment with a coarse resolution, But now consider, what if we double the resolution of the search grid on this problem? And we say that our start and goal configurations, as well as our obstacle, remain the same. So with a high resolution, we can more finely capture the structure of the environment. But also, for such a problem, we need to search through many more intermediate cells in order to find the path connecting the start to the goal. And therefore, we need to perform more computations when executing our search-based algorithm, because we need to check and explore, remember, expand the nodes of the graph in order to find the path. And this becomes even more complex if we have an increasing number of dimensions. For example, if we have a UAV that's in a three-dimensional environment, then we would need to search through so-called voxels or 3D cells, and this would scale rather poorly, making it infeasible and prohibitively slow to be run online and onboard physical platforms if we use a search-based strategy. And sampling-based methods try to address this problem of poor scalability of search-based methods. Let's try to understand intuitively how this is done. So, when we looked at our path that we got from A star here, we noticed that many of the cells are simply a straight line connecting the start configuration to the proximity of the obstacle. So we notice that many of these cells are simply intermediate connections traveling through the free space. So then we start to ask ourselves, could we get some kind of shortcut method where we can skip the expansion of all these nodes or all these cells here and find a straight line connecting the start to close to the obstacle directly, without going through the actual process and all the computations that are involved in searching this free space free of obstacles. So if only there was some way to sample here in this area and then form a straight line connection directly. This would significantly reduce the number of computations that we have to do in this region. And then, following a similar logic, we could sample another node here and only consider these 4 nodes when connecting the start to the goal. Even in the simple example, we can see how this would be a much more efficient method of finding a path. And this is exactly the key idea that's underlying sampling-based approaches and the main insight that they use to obtain computational efficiency. So in this case, we don't need the grid at all, because we can just operate based on the nodes that we have sampled and connect them together to form a collision-free path, which corresponds to our solution of the path planning problem. And so let's try to put this into steps and formulate a general approach for sampling-based planners. So as in our simple example, the first thing we did was to sample configurations in the free space. So over here, we tried to figure out samples corresponding to nodes that we can use as intermediate connections between the start and the goal. And secondly, we also need a method of connecting them to our roadmap. So in this case over here, we first formed a straight line to the first intermediate node, and then the second one, and finally towards the end. So we're continually repeating this process of sampling and connecting. And these are the 2 key steps in the general approach of sampling-based planners. And one might notice that using this approach, we're operating on a very small subset of the problem space. So unlike previously with grid-based or search-based planning, we did not consider all the possible locations that a robot can go to from a particular node. Instead, we're applying this random sampling strategy in order to find a simpler problem. And this is the main motivation behind Monte Carlo techniques, which try to solve a deterministic problem using stochastic sampling when it's very complex. So we try to look at a simpler problem, and we give up some of that optimality and completeness in order to obtain computational efficiency with sampling. So two main questions arise here if we want to start implementing, from a practical point of view, sampling-based planners. So the first one is obviously, how do we sample? So how do we select which nodes should come next and should be considered for being added to our graph of free space configurations and connections? A second and very crucial question is, how do we actually collision check these samples? So if I have just executed step 1 and found a new node in my configuration space, how do I check its validity with respect to all the other nodes that I might currently have in my graph? And this step is fundamental in sampling-based approaches. It's called collision checking. So on the next slides, we look at how we can actually answer these questions. And so for sampling, what we typically do is uniform random sampling. So in a known environment, as we said, we know the extent of the robot coordinates of its configuration. And we can simply use a random number generator in order to find a random value, for example, for each of these coordinates. However, it's important to be aware that also more advanced sampling techniques exist as well. So this is how a random uniform sampling strategy would work in an environment with two obstacles and a narrow passage in between them. However, we can also, and this may be relevant for some other problems, use a regular grid where we only constrain ourselves to sample in a regular fashion between the nodes corresponding to grid cells. In some problems, it might also be useful to use a so-called bridge test sampling strategy. And here we bias the sampling of new nodes in region between obstacles. So for example, here we have a very narrow passageway between the two red obstacles, and using a bridge test approach, we obtain more samples that we check for connectivity in the area between them. And as we will see, this type of strategy is very useful for exactly problems like this one, where by uniform random sampling, we have a very low probability of samples falling in this narrow region that's actually crucial for connecting the two parts of the problem space together. So this is a technique for biasing sampling in a directed way as opposed to just using a random generator. And another strategy that also exists is medial axis, where we try to sample away from obstacles as far away as possible. So here we see the black dots, which are the samples, being formed in a sort of line far away from the obstacles and around the robot. And this might be relevant for situations where we're interested in obtaining very high clearance between the robot and the obstacles. And so we want to create a roadmap with a maximum safety region around the robot using sampling in this way. So for purposes of this lecture, when we talk about sampling, we mostly refer to uniform sampling, but it's important to be aware that other techniques exist, and there are various research works that study the effects of these sampling strategies and what their role is in overcoming some of the problems we may experience with sampling-based approaches. So that's it about sampling. And so now if we have these black dots, these nodes, how can we actually form the edges or the links between them? So how can we check if the path that connects two samples is actually collision-free? And this is where collision checking comes in, which is at the core of sampling-based methods. So over here we have a system diagram showing the paradigm of sampling-based strategies. And so over here in our algorithm, we have a module which effectively samples the configuration space, which we just discussed. And we also have another module that executes the actual search. So it looks at the connections between our samples on our nodes and how we can connect them in order to find a feasible path between different configurations that we want to target. However, what bridges the gap between the actual search and the sampling is the collision detection or the collision checking module. This is a sort of black box where the algorithm asks, are the two samples in collision? And then we get an answer whether yes or no. And if they are without collisions, then we can form an edge connecting them and add this to our roadmap of current configurations. So the collision detection is usually very implementation specific. It leverages the actual geometry of the robot in the environment and then tries to overlay them on top of each other and see whether two configurations are in collision. So let's make this more specific. So the collision checking black box does use an explicit representation of the obstacles based on the geometric models. So for example, if we have two objects, we can use geometry to approximate them with circles here and check whether these two circles intersect with each other. And if so, then yes, there is a collision, and no, we cannot add an edge and a collision-free path between these objects. And so this could be done for objects such as a car, which have a geometry that is accurately represented with such a shape, for example, circles. And for sampling-based planning, we often talk about paths. So if we have a path, say between two nodes, what we typically do is sample the intermediate points between these nodes and check if they intersect an obstacle. So for example, in this curved path, we look at all the intermediate points in between, we subsample it, and then we check in the geometrical space whether this is actually intersecting an obstacle. And based on this, we can get our collision checking answer and develop our roadmap. So there are different ways of actually sampling such a path. So for example, we can go from the start to the goal and move in very small increments. And then at each increment, we can add a point and see whether it's intersecting. That could be one approach. An alternative strategy could be to always bisect the path. So always look at the point in between and check whether it's in collision. So for example, here in our curved path, we would have the center, then so the quarter of the path, and we would always check, and this could be faster if we want to look at the path as a whole rather than looking incrementally in small steps from the start to the goal. So what we do in practical implementations of sampling-based techniques is we have a collision checking module or a function that we call with our inputs, for example, our nodes, and it performs this type of check for us. And this is useful for anyone that wants to implement such a sampling-based planner to know exactly how this module fits in. And of course, it's relatively intuitive that this subsampling especially could take a lot of time. So actually 90% of the time that we invest in sampling-based planner often comes from the collision checking step. So there are many techniques for actually speeding up the collision checking procedure in order to obtain higher computational efficiency, especially for very time-critical problems and robots. So now that we know how to implement these two steps and the overview of the paradigm of sampling-based planners, how can we compare different algorithms? And this is very similar to the criteria that we looked at in our lecture on search-based planning methods. So first, as before, we have the criterion of completeness. So this tells us, does our algorithm find a solution when it exists or report failure otherwise? Especially in the context of sampling-based planning, a key idea is probabilistic completeness. This basically means that if we continue to keep sampling in our strategy, so if we let our algorithm do more work and give it more time, does it converge to a solution? So does the probability of finding a solution converge to 1 over time? And if we have several algorithms that are probabilistically complete, then we can compare their performance based on the rate of convergence. The rate of convergence tells us how fast does this algorithm actually find a path. We can compare this by measuring the amount of time that the stochastic algorithms take in various planning trials and then taking the average. And then we can look at what average values do we obtain for different algorithms and see which one converges faster. So which one finds the average solution in a less average amount of time. Another important criterion is optimality. So is the solution that the algorithm gives us the best possible one in terms of how we define the cost? And here we said that the cost is in terms of the path length. So the shortest path is the optimal path. For sampling-based planners, an analog of probabilistic completeness here is asymptotic optimality. So if we sample more and let our algorithm do more work in more time, does the probability of finding the optimal or the best possible solution approach to 1? This implies that our algorithm is actually improving the path over time if it can converge to the best possible one. And finally, a third criterion that we looked at is time and space complexity. So how fast do our algorithms run and how much memory do they consume? And due to their nature, sampling-based algorithms are not directly comparable, for example, with search-based methods, which treat the space explicitly. And because of due to the nature of sampling and stochasticity, we often express complexity as a function of the input, and we can also measure the complexity per sample. So at each iteration of the algorithm, at each sample that we take, how much time is consumed by the algorithm and how much memory. And again, here we often take averages to account for the random nature of the algorithms. So the next concept that we want to introduce is multi-query and single-query planning. So now that we understand the general idea behind sampling-based planning and how we can go about implementing the two key steps of sampling and collision checking, we can move on to trying to categorize and understand specific algorithms. So one category of sampling-based planners is multi-query. So multi-query algorithms build a roadmap of the environment which is then suitable for querying for different planning problems in a repeated way. So we usually invest quite a lot of time in capturing the connectivity of the free space using a roadmap, and then assuming that the environment doesn't change, so is static, and that the robot model is also unchanged, we can repeatedly query the same roadmap for different planning problems, so for different start and for different goal configurations. And this could be useful in static environments, as we said. So one example that we look at in detail in this lecture is the probabilistic roadmap. So here we have just a very conceptual schematic of how the probabilistic roadmap, a multi-query planner, works. So in the first step, the probabilistic roadmap is developing the roadmap, so capturing the connectivity. So here we have some obstacles, and we can see nodes incrementally being added into the roadmap, into the graph. And this is how we effectively probe our configuration space without looking at it as a whole. So we look at small samples, see if they're in free space, form the collision check. And then given that, we can then query start and goal configurations and use a search-based algorithm, for example, A* or Dijkstra's algorithm, in order to connect these two configurations in a collision-free way by following the edges of the roadmap. And so if our environment and our robot don't change, we don't have to repeat the sampling-based steps again. We can just query again with a different start and goal configuration. And so this is why we call approaches such as the probabilistic roadmap multi-query planning, because they're suitable for multiple queries with the same sampling representation. So what if our environment does change, or what if we have a different robot? Then it might be more appropriate to use incremental single query planners. So instead of building a roadmap of the entire environment, these methods are usually tree-based. So typically we start from the start configuration and we gradually extend the tree by sampling towards the goal. And we stop when we find the goal there. So this is very different to sampling first and then querying second. Here we are extending the tree by forming new branches according to our sampling and our collision checking strategy. And so here is again a very conceptual example of how this is done in one of the most popular single query algorithms, the rapidly exploring random tree. Again, we look at this one later, but just to understand that starting from the start, we sample, we add new branches, perform the collision checks, and then we actually stop where we find the goal. So this is very efficient when we only have the start and the goal configurations and we're only interested in forming the connection between them. Of course, we can reuse the tree later in another planning problem and make some adjustments, but this approach is particularly suitable and lends itself to being very efficient for such single query tasks when we have a very isolated planning problem. So this is some ways in which we can categorize algorithms, whether they are multi-query, so roadmap-based, or single query, where they are more tree-based and they grow from the start to the goal. So here's a pseudocode of how multi-query compares to single query. So this is just putting procedural steps on the images that we saw in the previous slides. So the multi-query or graph-based planner effectively samples, then uses some logic to figure out the connectivity between the new sample and the existing nodes in the graph or the roadmap. And then it uses the collision checking connection step in order to add them if the feasibility check returns positive, so that if the two configurations are collision-free. A single query, a tree-based planner, on the other hand, operates in an incremental fashion. So over here we also sample, and then we extend the tree in some direction towards the sample, and we make this more concrete soon when we discuss particular algorithms. And so we extend the tree in that direction and then form connection if the path is feasible between the new connection based on the sampled configuration and the existing closest node in the tree. And so this is just showing us the different logic between multi-query and single query planners so that we can appreciate their differences and how they lend themselves to application for different planning problems, depending on the setting, whether we want to do frequent tree planning in a static environment or we're interested in very efficient single query planning, potentially in dynamic environments here. So when we look at the pseudocode, one important thing to notice is how these steps that we discussed already appear in both of the planners. So remember we asked how to sample, and here we see sampling happening in both the multi-query and single query planners. And we also asked how to collision check, which is what is happening when we add new nodes to our tree or our graph. So these two steps are at the core of every sampling-based planner, and the logic of the implementation is what differs between the algorithms, and that's exactly what we're going to discuss next, starting with a commonly used multi-query planner. So now we can start to apply our new knowledge on sampling-based methods and have a detailed look at a very popularly used multi-query roadmap-based algorithm, the probabilistic roadmap, or the PRM. The probabilistic roadmap was introduced in 1996 as one of the first algorithms that could solve high-dimensional configuration space motion planning problems, for example, in 4 or 6 dimensions. And as in other roadmap-based planners that we just encountered, it consists of 2 key steps. So let's have a look at them now in more detail. So the first stage of the probabilistic roadmap is called the learning phase. And this is where we actually do the sampling and collision checking in order to build a roadmap capturing the connectivity of the free space. So in the learning phase, we take samples and we add them to a roadmap, and we end up with something like this, where in an environment with several different obstacles here in gray, we have some nodes, so the dots and the lines connecting them. These are the edges or the collision-free paths. And here the nodes, vertices, and configurations are used interchangeably. And in the second phase, we specify our start and a goal configuration. So for example, here on the top left and on the top right. And given this roadmap, we can just add them by creating an additional edge. And then we have a discrete representation of our environment, and we can use a search-based algorithm, for example, Dijkstra or A star, in order to find a path from the start to the goal. And this would be, in this representation, for example, if we use A star, the shortest possible path, depending on how our roadmap looks like. And so, reinforcing this point, we note again that by investing more time here in the learning phase, we can actually perform multiple planning queries on the same roadmap. So we can ask our graph to find paths from different start and goal configurations, assuming the environment doesn't change in between the queries. So these are the 2 key steps. So let's have a look at actually how this happens step by step. So say we have an environment, here we have different obstacles and free space. and we have a known environment. It is assumed, so we know the geometry of all the obstacles. So then we do sampling. So we sample, in this case, uniformly by using random number generation, for example, to find different samples given the extent of the environment. In this case, a 2D example. And then say some of our samples, for example, the orange ones, they fall in the free space, and others, the pink one, they fall in the obstacles. So we're not interested in the pink ones here because they're invalid configurations. And the way we know this is using our collision checking black box. For example, if we approximate the model of the robot, as we just saw, with a circle, and we find that it lies in collision with the obstacle, then we can discard the sample or this configuration from our roadmap because it's not located in the free space. And then we need to connect these points somehow in order to generate the roadmap. And this is where the collision checking comes in. So we say, I want to see if the path connecting these two configurations is in collision. And then our function collision checker tells us yes or no, and based on that we can either generate edges or not. And so for example, over here, if we were checking whether these two nodes are in collision, we can connect them with a straight line path and then apply that subsampling strategy to see if any of the intermediate configuration is actually in collision. So in this case, we saw that here, over here, the pink sample of the straight line path, it does intersect this obstacle, and then we would not create an edge in a roadmap between these two nodes. And of course, over here, an implementation detail is how we actually implement our collision checking strategy. Because if we're stepping through intermediate points, we need to make sure that the interval between them is small enough so that we don't accidentally miss or skip an obstacle. So in this case, the interval was selected in the appropriate way because we saw that there was an obstacle in between, and we did encounter a collision there which prevents us from creating an edge. And then that would be the end of our learning phase, where we sample and collision check. And in the query phase, we specify the start and goal configuration. And so here over the green. And then we add edges connecting them to our roadmap in the free space. And then we use our graph search-based algorithm, for example, A star, in order to find in green the final path with respect to our roadmap that we have sampled in the first phase. So one practical detail here is how do we actually connect new nodes, new samples to the roadmap if we have many of them. Because intuitively, if we sample a new configuration and we have to execute that collision check for every single node already in the graph, this would take quite a lot of computational time and also be relatively unnecessary, because if there are obstacles in the environment and we attempt a connection from a node at one side of the environment to another one far away, then it's likely that there will be an obstacle in between and a straight line connection would not be possible. So from a practical point of view, what we do in the probabilistic roadmap is specify some kind of radius, and then we only check for collisions and connections within that radius. So the radius specified a ball centered around the newly sampled node. And then we look at that and we see which other nodes are there already in the graph. And then we looked at each of them in turn and checked for collisions, generating edges. And the way that we specify a radius is quite important because it determines how much computational time our roadmap will take, and also the structure of the graph. So how our graph will look. Will the nodes be relatively close together, Or are we also allowing the leeway to also look at long distance connections? And so over here, in terms of algorithmically, our radius comes into play when we just sample a new configuration in the free space, and then we have this concept of the neighborhood. So we only attempt connections that are within the neighborhood. And if they are, yes, in the same neighborhood and they're also collision-free, then we do add them to our graph. And this is how we develop in the learning phase our probabilistic roadmap that we can then query for different planning problems. So here's an animation of exactly how this works with different polygonal obstacles, and the roadmap is being created by uniform sampling. New edges are being formed in the learning phase. So it's important to note here that we actually cover the free space quite quickly if we use random sampling, because we're treating the whole free space as the extent of the environment as the region where we can sample. So with only a few iterations, and this is commonly observed with sampling-based methods, we actually get a rather good coverage of the free space. So the advantages of the probabilistic roadmap are intuitively it's simple and it's easy to implement. So in terms of implementation, we only need our sampling strategy and our collision checking unit, which we define based on our problem. And also, we have probabilistic completeness with this method. And why is that? So if we let our probabilistic roadmap sample for longer, then it's likely to capture the connectivity of the free space very densely. And if there is a path, it will find it if we let it sample for long enough. So in other words, if we keep adding samples to a roadmap, and there is physically a path connecting the start to the goal, the roadmap will find it eventually. And this is what we mean by probabilistic completeness. As we discussed, it's also suitable for multi-query planning, so this is often used in static environments when we need to replan, even for different planning tasks. So what are some disadvantages? So if we use uniform sampling, one classical problem that arises is called the narrow passages problem. So if we have a very complicated environment, for example, this one, where the light blue is the obstacles and the white is free space, and we sample uniformly, so we don't bias our sampling in any way in the area in the center, then there will be a relatively low density of samples in the free space in this very narrow region. So we can see here the black dots are the ones that are actually in the free space, and there are only a handful of them in this narrow passage here because we didn't sample extensively enough in order to populate this area with free space samples. So this could be a problem if we want to plan a path from one side of the environment to another and through this narrow passage, because we simply don't have enough density of samples to capture the zigzag pattern that's happening here. And so even when we try to connect free space samples within the narrow passage to each other, we'll run into collisions and we won't be able to find suitable roadmap connectivity here. And our algorithm will report infeasibility actually unless it samples for very long. So this is one of the inherent disadvantages of sampling-based methods if we use uniform sampling and have no knowledge of the structure of the environment. And the way that we get around this is, for example, using sampling strategies that bias sampling between the obstacles, and then we would have more samples here that we can actually connect and try to find a path. So it can be quite tricky, and we might need to use some additional methods of applying these strategies, such as the probabilistic roadmap in narrow passages. As a consequence of the narrow passages problem, we also find commonly a lack of connectivity between different graphs in the environment. And so this is what these pictures are showing actually, where we did find some free space samples and collision-free edges between them in these environments, but we didn't sample enough or densely enough in order to connect them to each other. So we have, in principle, different disconnected components in the free space rather than one roadmap as we would like to see if we want to plan paths in this environment. So the same thing is happening here in the simple environment where we have a more regular sampling strategy, but the same issue arising exactly. And again, by addressing the problems of narrow passages with specialized sampling techniques, we can try to avoid or at least improve on these issues. And finally, of course, our probabilistic roadmap is not suitable for dynamic environments or frequent replanning if there are changes occurring. So in the next part, we look at tree-based planners which address exactly this issue. To address these issues, in the next part of the lecture, we look at tree-based planners, which are efficient single-query planners in very complex or high-dimensional problem spaces. So the general concept underlying tree-based planners is as follows. So here we have the steps. So the tree-based planner is firstly directional. So we start with a starting node or starting configuration, and then we directionally grow a tree from it. To grow the tree, we have two steps as before. So we sample new nodes at random, and then we attempt collision checking in order to connect them to the tree and create new branches. We then repeat this procedure until we either reach the goal node or the goal configuration or an area in its vicinity. Then we have solved our path planning problem. This is a general approach underlying such planners, and the way that different specific algorithms in this category differ is in that how they implement the sampling and the collision checking. So typically they use a heuristic that also gives the algorithm its name. And there are many examples of tree-based planners. In this lecture, we consider the rapidly exploring random tree and the asymptotically optimal version of it. But there are also others that are based on the similar general approach. For example, some of these algorithms grow multiple trees in a parallel where these computational capabilities are available and thus try to find a solution quicker, whereas others grow the tree also accounting for the kinodynamic constraints of the robot in order to make sure that the paths can be executed feasibly in the real world. The category of tree-based planners that we focus on here is called the rapidly exploring dense tree. This is a general family of planners that operate based on the principles on the previous slide. So there is a tree that's incrementally being constructed from the start to the goal. And if the sequence in which we do the sampling in this procedure is random, then the rapidly exploring dense tree is also called the rapidly exploring random tree, or RRT. And the RRT is an extremely popular algorithm for robotic motion planning in high-dimensional configuration spaces. And its motivation for being introduced was that it's actually able to handle kinodynamic constraints. And we get back to this later. One thing to note is the word dense refers to the branching out of the tree and how the actual tree structure looks over time as we add samples to it. So over here we can see examples of the RRT being grown in an environment without obstacles, so just in the free space, relatively early on in only 45 iterations, and later on in the algorithm at 2,345. So this is just sampling and adding new nodes to the tree. As we observed previously with the probabilistic roadmap, even early on there's a relatively good coverage of the environment due to the random nature of the sampling strategy. And then the word dense comes into play in the fact that as we add more samples, the representation of the environment gets denser as we have these small branches which capture the finer details, approximating the real continuous nature of the environment. So the more we sample, the denser our tree gets, and the more of these little branches we get so that we can generate really fine-grained plans. So here is a pseudocode algorithm for the RRT, and we're going to go through the steps conceptually to see how it works in practice if we want to implement it. So here we already see some of the familiar steps in terms of sampling and connection, and we now go through an example to illustrate them, how they work in this particular case for the RRT algorithm. And so we have, of course, an initial configuration and the number of vertices in the tree, so the number of iterations we want to do before we terminate the algorithm. And also what will come into play is this incremental distance, or so-called step size, that plays a role when we connect new tree nodes to the existing tree. And we'll see how that works in just a second. But the first procedure is obviously to sample a random configuration. So let's say we're starting from initial or starting node and we're growing a tree gradually towards the goal. We use our random number seed in order to generate a random configuration, for example, the green one here. And then the next step of the RRT is to check which is the vertex or the node in the tree that's nearest to it. So we have the tree structure, and we need, for example, a KD tree data structure in order to check the closest possible node with respect to the random node that we have just sampled. And we can check, for example, the Euclidean distance. And in this case, this turns out to be the orange one here. And then a next key step is that we generate a so-called new node in between these two nodes based on a step size parameter. So we say over here, we want to move a direction delta Q, a step size, towards the random node from the nearest node. And that's where the new node is. So we take a step towards the random node rather than just going there directly. And this is something that is user-defined in our algorithm. And so here we have that distance and the new node appearing in the direction of the previously sampled node. And the reason why we do this, or why we include the step size, is that otherwise our tree would attempt to connect very long distance connections and perform many checks in its search towards the goal. So we're trying to expand sort of locally here so that we can make smaller steps rather than going the whole way towards the newly sampled node. So obviously this delta Q is important because it controls how the branches of our tree will actually look. And one implementation detail here is that if we sample a new node in the vicinity of the near node, so if we're less than delta Q away from the nearest node in the graph, then we don't need this parameter and we just select that randomly sampled node as a connection point. And so to repeat that, what we do is sample a node, look for the nearest node on the tree, and then take a step towards it. That becomes our new node. Then we need to check, is this connection feasible? And if it is, we can add this new node and the edge to our tree, thus having expanded it. And we need to repeat this many times in order to grow our tree gradually starting from the starting node. One trick that we could do if we're looking for the goal is to be greedy some of the time. So how can we do this? So some fraction of the time we can say, instead of selecting a random node in the environment, what we can do is bias our search towards the goal. So every 5 or 10%, these are reasonable values, take a step towards the goal. So this encourages the tree to expand in that direction if we're doing single query planning, very targeted, focused on the goal. And the reason why we don't do this all the time, again, is because otherwise we would have a completely greedy strategy where the tree is always checking in the direction towards the goal, and thus it will get stuck quite likely in local minima if there is an obstacle in the way, which there usually is, because the vehicle would be very fortunate otherwise to have a simple straight line connection between the start and the goal. So every once in a while, instead of sampling randomly, set the newly sampled node as the goal and repeat this procedure so that we can actually grow our tree in a directed way. So the tree expands and explores the area very rapidly, and this is where the name comes from. And so here's an example of how this works in an animation. So the black circles are the obstacles in this 2D environment, and the red crosses are the start and the goal. So we have some step size, and we're sampling very quickly here new nodes with the triangle and growing our tree as shown by the green lines. These are the branches. And at some point, we have explored the free space enough such that we can actually we have found the goal, and what we can do then is simply trace the parents back of the tree. So look backwards, where did this branch actually come from, and draw that straight line connection. So this is RRT, finding for us a feasible path successfully from the start to the goal. There are many variants of the RRT, and some other algorithms are also inspired by it. So, for example, we can search using only a single tree, as we did in the animation. But another thing we can do is also do a bidirectional search. So in this case, we have two trees growing towards each other. So this could be helpful, for example, in a very complex environment, again, with a narrow passage, where we want to bias these two trees to search out towards each other and then connect at some point in the way. The idea is that this bidirectional search actually saves us some time, as opposed to a single tree, which is quite unlikely to make this very narrow connection. In other cases, it might also be helpful to grow a third tree, for example, the green one here, from another point in the environment. And in this case, we have several trees or a forest, which are all growing. Obviously, this requires more computational resources, but it lends itself very well to parallelization if we have these capabilities at our disposal. And then we can do many different things with different trees depending on the problem. So RRT Connect is a popular algorithm which grows two trees, one towards each other, and then every so often one of the trees looks for a possible connection to the other. And so this way we're using strategies, heuristics, which basically try to make as many shortcuts as possible so that these trees meet together quickly, so that we quickly have a possible solution. But as before, obviously the algorithm that we choose really depends on our environment and what are these properties that we have. In the case of narrow passageways, for example, we might want to consider using some of these specialized sampling strategies in the regions where there are many obstacles and low density of samples. So it's important in this case just to be aware that there are other variants of the RRT which can be helpful in particular situations. One motivation for having introduced the RRT is that it can also deal with kinematic and dynamic constraints on real robots. So far in all the examples and all the animations we looked at, we assumed that our robot can move from one point to another arbitrarily. And this is obviously not the case with real robots. For example, if we have this car-like robot with 4 wheels, it might have non-holonomic kinematic constraints. So it might have a system of equation that governs its motion. So this vehicle can't simply shift sideways, it needs to steer and turn. So we have some equations that are characterizing the relationship between our control inputs and the motion of the robot. The beauty of the RRT is that if we have such a system and we can capture such non-holonomic constraints, the RRT can actually support them very easily. And let's have a look at how we can do that. So if we want to use the RRT with such constraints, what is typically done is we look at our tree and we select a configuration or a node on it. Then we randomly sample the control input, so the possible set of controls that the robot can do from that configuration. For example, turning in a particular direction. And then we need to integrate the system of equations for a short period in order to generate the motion that reflects these sampled controls. So going back to our system of equation here, we can sample our control inputs and integrate over these equations to generate a motion. Then we can add this motion to our tree if it is collision-free. So we can do our collision checking based on the geometry of the robot and the obstacles, and if the path is feasible, then we can add this newly sampled path to the tree. And so how is this different to the RRT that we looked at in our examples in a pseudocode? So here we're doing the sampling over the space of control inputs rather than in the configuration space. And in this case, we might end up with a tree that looks something like this. Because if we have steering constraints, our vehicle must turn in particular ways, and this is where all these curvatures come from. Because the branches of the tree are being developed according to this type of behavior rather than being sampled in the geometric two-dimensional space as before. So this is one common structure of an RRT, obviously here it's in the free space, that we get if we're dealing with car-like robots. And here is an animation that shows a path in an environment with obstacles that was planned using such an approach, an RRT with kinematic constraints. So if we started from the top left of the environment and look for the goal on the bottom left, then we found a path that smoothly follows the abiding by the robot's curvature constraints through the environment, avoiding the obstacles and eventually reaching the goal. And in the diagram, we can also see the other branches that were not used to generate the final path. So these are the branches that were explored by the algorithm as the tree was being created. And on the right, we can just see visually an animation of how this actually works and making sure that our car-like robot with 4 wheels is actually operating smoothly and not executing these very jagged paths that we obtained with the RRT that was just sampling in the configuration space. So on that note, looking at our RRT paths, we noticed that they're definitely not the shortest paths. So just like the probabilistic roadmap, the more we sample, the more likely we are to find a feasible path, because eventually the RRT and other tree-based planners that operate on similar principles will explore the space densely. However, a drawback here is that if we sampled this path and we found the goal, we're basically done. So we have no concept of how we can actually improve this path, how can we make it shorter, and how can we make it more optimal. This is the question that we tackle next. So in the final part of the lecture, we look at how can we improve upon the quality of solutions obtained using our sampling-based techniques and also derive some guarantees on asymptotic optimality. The algorithms that we studied so far, the probabilistic roadmap and the rapidly exploring random tree, are probabilistically complete. This is easy to understand because, as we said, if we allow these algorithms to run longer, we have more nodes in our obstacle-free configuration space to capture its connectivity, and we're more likely to find a solution if it exists. However, these methods are not asymptotically optimal, so the longer they run, there is no guarantee that we'll find the shortest possible path. In fact, they're often very suboptimal because the paths produced, as we have seen, are rather jagged. For example, consider the RRT finding a solution in this environment with obstacles. We can see that the path goes relatively, there's a large clearance around the obstacles and also goes around it. And this is because of the nature in which we construct the tree. Every time we extend the tree by adding a new node and a new branch, we do not perform any operations on the tree that's already there, so we can't improve upon existing solutions. In fact, if we look closely at this environment, we can see that there is a much shorter way, the other way around the obstacle, and closer to it. And the main question is, can we design a new algorithm that actually allows us to obtain the shortest possible path? And the answer is yes. So here is a modified version of the RRT called the RRT star, which we'll look at, that allows us to obtain this optimal path. The RRT star is a star version of the RRT, which means it's asymptotically optimal. So we have similar for the PRM star. These algorithms bring in new ideas in order to allow us to obtain asymptotic optimality. There are two subtle insights that these algorithms make in order to provide this for us. So first, we want to modify our sampling strategy in a smart way. We want to sample nodes near a particular neighborhood in order to allow us to obtain asymptotic optimality. And for this, we can look at the underlying theory of random geometric graphs and connect it to the shortest path planning problem in robotics. And the second main insight is the rewiring of the graph or tree. So when we add a new node and when we extend our current data structure, we want to perform an update to the cost of the edges currently there so that we keep track of the shortest possible path. And these two main concepts are the ones underlying the asymptotically optimal sampling-based methods. As a further reading, the paper from the International Journal of Robotics Research on asymptotically optimal sampling-based planning is a highly recommended reading here because it points out very clearly the differences of the non-optimal and the optimal version of these planners and how they are derived, as well as the accompanying theorems and proofs. So we're going to look at some of these algorithms in more detail to understand where these properties come from. And the first one is called the rapidly exploring random graph. So unlike the probabilistic roadmap, the random graph is an incremental algorithm similar to the RRT that grows incrementally. However, a key difference is that it may contain cycles. So here is the pseudocode, and let's look at it step by step to see what kind of changes we need to make in this algorithm in order to obtain asymptotic optimality. And remember, if we run this code long enough, the asymptotically optimal theorems basically tell us that we are guaranteed, if we let to converge upon the shortest possible path over time. So in this algorithm, as in the other ones that we considered, the first step is to sample a node in the free space and try to connect it to the current version of the graph. And the key difference then comes into how we actually make these collision-free connections. So remember we have our collision-free checker, but which nodes do we want to check from? So which connections do we actually want to make? So if we have an obstacle-free configuration there, what we need to do is we need to look within a particular radius here to see which nodes currently in the graph are within the neighborhood of the nearly sampled new node. This radius is really the key insight as to what gives us asymptotic optimality. So what we want to do is design our radius of connectivity checks in order to take these ideas from random geometric graphs that give us properties of asymptotic optimality. So the radius defines which nodes in the neighborhood we want to check for connections. The radius here depends on the cardinality of the current set of vertices in the graph, a constant value, and also the dimensionality of the problem. And intuitively, if we want to plot this, the radius for checking for collisions, this is what it would look like. So this is the key insight here. So the radius actually decreases with the number of nodes in our tree, so the number of samples that we take. So relatively early on, we have a high number, a very large radius that we check. So if we're just starting out and building our graph, we have a relatively large radius and we check all the neighbors in the neighborhood of the newly sampled node for collision checks. And this is basically the range we want to consider when we add new nodes to our graph. However, over time, as our graph gets bigger and we collect more nodes, when we sample, we only look at a very local portion of the search space. And so in this way, there is a rate of conversions that is effectively inversely proportional to the number of vertices or nodes currently in our graph. And in the paper on optimal motion planning, there are theorems that basically say that this sampling radius, when applied to the motion planning problem, preserves the properties of optimality. And this is really the main idea that we take from mathematics to bring it in here and find the optimal solution, the shortest possible path to the path planning problem. So the rapidly exploring random graph, again, is an incremental algorithm. It may contain cycles because we always check the neighborhood with respect to the current state of the graph. And we also added this new feature here, which is basically an adaptive radius based on the graph size that allows us to obtain asymptotic optimality. So one of the drawbacks here is because we're always connecting the nodes in this way, we have a boundary value problem effectively between each two nodes that we want to connect. So remember when we talked about kinodynamic constraints with the RRT, we tried to project sample new control inputs in order to extend the tree. And in the case of the rapidly exploring random graph, this isn't possible because we're always asking, are these two nodes in collision? And so it's rather difficult to simulate real robot dynamics for this problem. It's much easier in the case of the RRT when we have one node, one configuration, and we see sample control inputs to see where we can go next. And that will define our next configuration, the way that we actually integrate these equations of motion. And that is one drawback of the rapidly exploring random graph. So let's try to put these together and kind of consolidate these ideas. So we have so far the rapidly exploring random tree, which gave us rapid exploration, is quickly covering the space, And if we give it enough time, it can also get very dense to capture the connectivity. It is probabilistically complete, and it also supported kinodynamic constraints because we could sample control inputs from a particular configuration that is at the leaf of the tree. So that was the rapidly exploring random tree. And on the other hand, we just discussed the rapidly exploring random graph, which gave us properties of asymptotic optimality. So it had this nice trick with adaptive radius based on the graph size that allowed us to say that if we construct the graph for long enough time, we will actually get the optimal solution. And this connection is basically the link between robot motion planning and geometric graphs. Wouldn't it be nice if we could put these two ideas together? So if we have one algorithm that on one hand supported our real robot dynamics and would also give us rapid exploration, but also gave us asymptotic optimality. And this is where a new approach called the RRT star comes in. The RRT star is basically RG, so the rapidly exploring random graph with no cycles. So we take these ideas of exploration and tree building from the RRT, we combine them with asymptotic optimality of the RG, and we come up with the RRT star, which is a tree-based approach that gives us asymptotic optimality. And because we have a tree structure here, we can always look at the edges of the tree or the leaves, the nodes that are the furthest away from the start. And if we want to consider kinematic or dynamic constraints, all we have to do is sample some control inputs and see where that will take us next. So unlike the RG, again, we don't have this boundary value problem where we have two nodes in the configuration space, and we have to see whether they're kinodynamically feasible to connect. So the RRT star uses both of these tricks that we introduced in our discussion about asymptotically optimal planners. So it uses this adaptive radius for nearest neighbors, just like the graph version. But, and we won't go into this too much detail, but it rewires the tree as better paths are discovered. So it effectively updates the costs of the tree in order to make sure we preserve the shortest possible path. And these are the two key ideas that we use in this algorithm in order to bring the advantages of both of the methods together to obtain a tree-based structure with an asymptotically optimal solution. So looking into just a little more detail about this rewiring step, here is how it looks in practice in the rewiring procedure. And so if we sample a new random node over here, we can set our radius, remember, based on the graph size using the formula from the RG. And this is what we see here in the shaded circular area. And then we need to see which of the nodes that are considered its neighbors based on the radius has the shortest possible connection to it. And so which node should be its parent? So which node will give us the shortest possible path from the newly sampled node all the way back to the start? And then when we identify this, what the RRT star does is rewires the remaining connections in the tree, the nodes that are in the radius, so that it preserves the shortest possible path. And this rewiring procedure is illustrated here to show the differences between the normal RRT, which does not perform this type of update according to the paths of the nodes when they're newly added to the tree. So to summarize, the RRT star is a combination of the RRT and the RG, which gives us a tree-based search strategy with asymptotic optimality. And the two major insights that we obtain here are, in order to get these properties, are the rewiring procedure illustrated here on the slide, as well as the adaptive radius, which depends on the size of the tree at a current point in time. That's it for the theory and the procedure. So how does this look in practice? So here we see an obstacle-free environment and comparing the trees that we obtain using the RRT and the RRT star. So the RRT on the top, it can quickly find the solution, but obviously this path is very suboptimal if we want to move from the center over here to the top right. So over time, we get a very dense coverage of the space, but we cannot update the path that we already found. And this is because we don't have mechanisms for rewiring the tree or sampling in a smart way to make sure that we get the shortest possible path. And so the path kind of curves out and does not correspond to a very straight line connection. The RRT star, on the other hand, finds the shortest, the same path very quickly, but then thanks to that rewiring procedure, it can update it actually, because the tree is not fixed. So the more we sample, the more dense we can benefit from making the space more denser, also in terms of the path that we obtain. And this is the key idea between asymptotic optimality. So even if we find a solution relatively early, the rewiring allows us to improve that solution over time so that we can get a shorter path. And as we can see over here, the shorter path is logically the straight line connection almost between the start and the center and the goal on the top right. It's also helpful noting here just the different ways in which the RRT and the RRT star are branching out and the visual differences between the tree structures that we obtain using both of these methods. Here's an animation also highlighting the differences, which is again along very similar lines. So we have an environment with the black circles, there are obstacles, and here's the animation of the RRT that we saw earlier. And now that we know what RRT star is like, we can actually compare and contrast the differences in terms of the way we grow the tree and also based on the final solution. So the RRT star node that takes more time to find the solution. So over here the RRT is almost done, and here we're still sampling, for example. But it does eventually give us a much shorter path. So if we want to think about ways to save computational efficiency, then it would be very helpful to implement some of these tricks, for example, for efficient collision checking in the RRT star version, because it does require more time to find the optimal solution in comparison to RRT, which is very efficient at quickly getting a rough solution. So with that, we come to an overview of all the methods that we have discussed. So here is a good table which shows compares and contrasts the similarities and differences in terms of those criteria we laid out at the very start of the lecture. So we can see that most of the algorithms we look at here are probabilistically complete due to the stochastic nature of sampling and the way that we build the graph or tree. But not all of them provide asymptotic optimality. So over here we see the PRM star, the RRT star, and the RG, which we just encountered, and the key benefits that they give us. And on the right side here, we can see also a comparison in terms of the time and space complexity as the function of the number of samples in a fixed environment. So when we want to implement one of these algorithms, it's important to consider what the environment looks like, what type of planning problems we're expecting to address, whether it's single query, multi-query planning, how much computational resources we have, and what is our end goal. Do we want to find a rough solution very quickly using a non-optimal method, for example, the RRT, or is asymptotic optimality very important? And if it is, and also computational efficiency is an issue, then we definitely need to think about some methods of basically collision checking more quickly or similar in order to speed up methods such as the RRT star. And just to note here, we have also another algorithm that we didn't cover in this lecture called the simple probabilistic roadmap. And for that, you can consult the reference on sampling-based planners over here on the slide, which also explains where the different properties come from in terms of the algorithms and their structure. If we want to implement these methods in practice, we often do some post-processing. And this is because the paths that we obtain using sampling-based strategies are often rather jagged and difficult for robots to follow, as we have seen, due to the heuristic nature of the ways in which we expand the graph or tree structure, and also how we sample. So if we sample randomly, it's not going to create very natural paths, let's say, for robots to follow in the real world. And so for this reason, it's helpful to draw attention to different methods of post-processing with a view towards real-world applications. So one thing we commonly do is we have a path obtained, for example, through the RRT approach, that may be rather jagged, as we saw in the animations, contains lots of edges. So one thing we could do is use a post-processing technique that effectively checks for different nodes on the path and see if there is a direct line of sight connecting them. So if a collision check between two different nodes would pass here. And if this is the case, then we can effectively circumvent the edge and just connect them directly, which should give us a much shorter path. And this is sometimes used in the non-optimal methods in order to shorten their paths and avoid these rough edges, which are difficult for real robots. And another post-processing technique that's commonly done is path smoothing. So in order to address these very edgy paths, what we could do is fit, for example, a polynomial spline, example a B-spline or similar, in order to get a smooth connection. And then this path would be much more feasible to execute on real robots. So these methods are just helpful to consider if we want to implement sampling-based methods in practice. We do often do some post-processing to make them more feasible for real execution. And with that, in this module, we come to end of the planning part, actually. So it's helpful to look back on our planning system structure and the hierarchical nature in which we do planning in the real world. So we discussed different planning methods, different aspects of the path planning problem, different criteria for evaluating algorithms, and also look very closely into sampling-based and search-based methods. So now we can go back to our planning architecture and see how these concepts actually fit in. So as we said in our introductory lecture, we often plan in a hierarchical way. So we have typically a global plan, which is based on a map and the robot location. And so here we generate a very high-level plan for the robot to move from a start configuration to a goal configuration. And for this step, we can use an approach such as the RRT or the A-star to plan on the scale of the wider environment. And then beyond that, we also have a local planner that runs at a much higher frequency, for example, the frequency of the sensor, and actually performs reactive actions and modifications if they're necessary. So this is helpful, for example, in dynamic environments. If obstacles are coming up, then the local planner would be able to react and avoid these obstacles. And this adds an extra safety layer. Otherwise, as we said, we would simply be executing the global plan without catering for any uncertainties or dynamic aspects of the environment. The local planner then sends the commands to the robot controller, which is in charge of actually executing them on the real physical actuators and making this motion happen in the real world. So our sampling-based and search-based methods were over here in the global planner. And this is basically the task that we're considering with these methods. But we should also realize that there is typically a lower level local planner operating that is in charge of performing these reactive and corrective tasks in our planning architecture. So to close the part about planning, let's have a look at an example, a very simple one from colleagues' work that actually shows how a local planner runs on a UAV in a very dense and initially unknown environment. So over here we have kind of a top-down view where the colored structures are obstacles in the environment. And we will see a UAV trying to plan a path from the top left to the bottom right. And in this case, our global plan would simply be a straight line connection, assuming that the environment is initially unknown. So this is not very complicated, such as the A star or the RRT, but it's just to illustrate the differences between a global and a local plan in this scenario. And then, as the UAV sensor encounters these colored obstacles in this environment, what we'll see is actually reactive behavior so that the robot can execute its mission in a safe way. And this is independent of the global plan, which we specified on the outset. And so over here, the black line is basically showing the global plan, and on the purple, we can see the robot following and performing evasive maneuvers to avoid any collisions with the obstacles. And this gives us, simple example gives us a very good idea of the hierarchy involved when we actually want to deploy planning algorithms on a full navigation stack on board our robots. And it's also rather insightful to see how these different elements actually come together in a real robot system, from the global planning down to the local planning and all the different modules, for example, in sampling-based methods, the sampling procedure and the collision checking, how they fit in together to make this run on a real robotic system. And with that, we come slowly to the end of this lecture about sampling-based methods. So we had an overview of sampling-based techniques and the basic principles underlying them, so the sampling, the collision checking, what criteria can we use to evaluate our algorithms, and which kind of categories of planners are there, the single and multi-query. And then we looked at multi-query roadmap-based planners, especially focusing on the probabilistic roadmap, and highlighted key differences with respect to tree-based planners, especially the rapidly exploring random tree. And then we took these ideas and we tried to, let's say, upgrade our algorithms to obtain asymptotically optimal versions based on the ideas of random geometric graphs, and also making adaptations to the structure of our graph or tree in order to preserve the shortest possible path if we give the algorithms enough time to find them. And finally, the lecture was concluded with a look at some practical considerations, both for sampling-based planners, such as post-processing, as well as what tools we actually need to develop a full navigation stack for our robots, and how the navigation procedure is subdivided into global and local planning.